So let's get into options. The options begins when you escort the patient, as the patient coordinator, when you escort the patient back into the room where you have conducted your discovery. Now, I didn't make a particular emphasis of this during the discovery component, but I think it's very important that you have these conversations in separate rooms. Okay, in what I mean by separate, I mean separate from a waiting room, separate from any reception areas. It's got to be private. So when you're having these kind of conversations that are emotional in nature and you're really delving into what's important to people, people will feel a lot more comfortable opening up when they're in private. As well, you remember the proper seating that I suggested where you're about 90 degrees in angle against each other. I think it's very important not to have a desk in between you. I know that's very common in some offices to have a desk in between, but actually that has been demonstrated in psychological studies to reduce the level of rapport that can be established between two people when you have a physical barrier in between. So a coffee table's fine, coffees are even better, but the idea is to remove any barriers that are between you and also to reduce the clutter in that room. As well, I would suggest to you that you want the seat of the patient facing inwards and not against any windows. Why would I suggest that? Well, windows are distracting. Things happen outside and behind you that may in fact cause a distraction for patients to not have their focus on you. So therefore, I suggest to have yourself seated back against a wall and have the patient facing you as opposed to facing any type of window. Now, I know some clinics and offices have some restrictions around what you can feasibly do in particular office because often clinics are not designed for sales in mind. They're designed for medicine in mind. Unfortunately, then as an afterthought, we need to think, oh yeah, we need to actually include some sales rooms in order to make this work so that when we get involved in advising clinics to get started, when we discuss with people on building plans and things like that, we make sure that we communicate to them that there need to be sales rooms as part of this clinic. So the private spaces so that you can have conversations with patients, not only for consultations, but also for potentially asking for referrals a few months down the road. So I would suggest to you that that's an important aspect, but that's a segue from what we were talking about. I'd like to bring it back now to what we are really discussing in this options component, which is about talking about what kinds of options the patient can look forward to now that we have the big issue addressed. What was the big issue? Well, we know the patient is now suitable for what we're offering. We know that the doctor has recommended what it is that the patient should be doing. Now it's a question of when, yeah? It's no longer a question of if, and I want you to really think about that. At no point during the option stage should you be asking a question, do you want to do this? Yeah? It's a given now. We have to assume. Yeah, we do not want to ask the patient if they want to have surgery at this stage. We want to assume they do want to have it. We just have to discuss when, okay? It's like, for example, when you go to a restaurant and you're ready to have dinner and you wait in the queue for a while and then you get escorted to your table. You look at the menus and the waiter comes up to you and says to you, "Would you like to eat?" Well, obviously you'd like to eat. Otherwise, why would you be at that restaurant? The question is not would you like to eat, it's what would you enjoy having today? So we really want to assume those particular facts, and we don't want to bring into question any ideas that perhaps we're not ready at this time for surgery or there's more to think about. This is actually the time that all we need to do is choose dates first and then ask for money later. So here are some principles behind offering options and presenting options. We want to obviously sell the benefits that we have learned are important to the patient. We want to obviously emphasize the ease of adoption. We want to make things easy at this stage. It shouldn't be complicated and difficult. Yeah, we want to reduce the amount of complexity that's involved in making any kind of appointment. Keep it simple, yeah, because people will almost take any opportunity of complexity to decide that they need to think about it. You need to make it simple. You also need to create realistic expectations. You need to reinforce any realistic expectations that were communicated by the doctor. You also want to present a maximum of 2 options. This is important because, again, the more options you present, the more people slow down, the less eager they are to make a decision because they have to think a lot more. Again, in case you don't believe me, this is an important aspect and that's again been proven by psychological studies where you present people with many options of particular products and ask them to taste each product. If they taste more than a few products, they become very confused. Their taste buds get very confused and it's difficult to process what's different. All you've got to do is reduce the amount of products and then it becomes all much more simpler to decide which product is the best one to choose. In this particular case, what we're talking about is not about products, we're talking about dates and times. So that's where we're going to go now. Now, after the examination, we want to get them into the room as soon as possible. We do not want to make them wait too long. Again, this is the time that is most vulnerable. This is the time where the patient has now realized that they are suitable for the treatment. They've been given a good recommendation. This is the time where doubts may creep in. Yeah? And we want to prevent patients from becoming their own worst enemies and creating fears around things that aren't necessary. Again, we wouldn't be doing this with patients if we didn't think it was what they wanted. That's why they've come in. But we do not want their fears to take over. And therefore, we need to make this process very smooth and get them into the room as soon as possible, so there's the minimum of waiting time between the recommendation and the discussion of options. If it could happen right after the other, it would be even better, but we have 2 different people doing these things, so that's just the way it has to be often. Doctors, if you can set up dates with the patient and just give the dates to the coordinator, that's even better. They can skip a lot of this part and move right on to money. But most of the time, doctors don't have an abundance of luxury time, so we need to pass them over to patient coordinators to do this important work. Now, patient coordinator, what you need to do is when you get back into the room, just like you did during the warm-up, you need to direct the seating of the client. You need to tell the patient, please have a seat here. Yeah, you don't have this sort of musical chair situation where people are trying to decide where to sit. Take control, be a leader, be their guide, and tell them where to sit. Once they've sat down, ask them if there's something that they'd like to drink. Ideally, there'd be nice if there was something nearby, like a little coffee maker or tea ready. That'd be great. Again, I recommend to you that people have something to drink. Number 1, it encourages them to open up a little bit more and relax. And the other thing too is that when people have a drink in their hand, especially a warm one, they sit longer in front of you. They're not too ready to rush out. And we need a little bit of time with them. So this is another little thing that we do to make sure that patients feel comfortable and can sit in and ease in and relax. Spend the time that they need to spend. We don't want them in a hurry at this stage. Make sure that on the table that where you're having this discussion, not in front of the patient, but to the side, there is nothing on that table that's going to create any kind of distraction. You probably want a pen, you want a calculator, and you want maybe your refreshments, and perhaps a couple of sheets that I'm going to discuss in a moment, which are called the money worksheets. These worksheets are things where we are going to list down the things that people need to understand about what was being offered, that it's written down on paper because it's a lot more convincing that way. And then these sheets are what we're going to decide with the patient to fill in order to get their written commitment to the procedure. So part of this is all about providing them with the good news before the bad news. Yeah, we want to make sure that they're emotionally invested in all of the hopes and expectations around the product before you talk to them about the fees, okay? And sometimes if you find that you're getting people become a little bit less sure at this stage, sometimes if there's a waiting period between the recommendation and the option stage, sometimes putting people in front of a film where that again re-emphasizes the benefits of the product that's being offered and shows people owning the benefits and using the benefits, that can be frequently a very useful thing to encourage people to put themselves in the picture and retain that level of enthusiasm. The more emotional film, the better. The more vivid, the better. The more it shows people enjoying their lives, doing the types of things that people do after procedures like these, the better. Again, we want people to put themselves into the picture and become emotionally engaged and not lose that and start thinking about other things. Now, we have to make sure at this stage that they want to be a patient. I know that may sound a little bit strange because we have to kind of assume that, but we want to make sure that there are no objections on the table before we get to the money. Yeah, the objections have to come before the money. Money has to be the last objection we handle if it happens at all. The reason for this is because if we've handled the money objection, if we've gone through all that work and there remain other medical objections, then we have even more work to do, and we probably will have to go back to the money to address that. So it's important to address all objections before the money comes into the conversation. Now, you want to emphasize how easy it is to get started. Let them know that the logistics are going to be handled entirely by you. All they have to do is pick a couple of dates, meaning the date for their treatment, potentially in some cases there is a separate date to sign the consent. Try to minimize the amount of appointments that are required in order to make sure that this is easy. Make the next appointment simple. Have a couple of options in mind. Again, they will have told you in the discovery when they want to have the treatment. Right? We talked about this in question 9 and question 10. When do they want to be free and clear, and when do they want to take the next step? Because we know that already, we would have already worked out a couple of different options. What I don't want you to do is sit there in front of the patient as you go through a process of going through dates with each other and hunting and pecking through the calendar, which could take many more minutes than you need to take. And it also is a very unemotional activity. It's a very unexciting activity to go through dates. Instead, have a couple of dates prepared, give them those two options, and then have them choose from one of them. If neither of those two work, then have another couple of options ready to go, as long as they fit in to what the patient wanted in the first place. We want to make sure that in everything that we discuss, we want to include some baby negatives into the equation. We want to make sure that not everything sounds completely perfect, and that there are a couple of things that need to be done beforehand in order to maintain some credibility and realism to what we're offering here. We want to make sure that we, like the practitioner before us, we tell them what the procedure is going to do, we tell them what it won't do. We also have to remember in our own minds during all this time that if objections occur, that it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be better than what they're doing right now. And this will also help you oversell the product. You present maximum of 2 options, and you want to make sure that there's an alternative if the patient hasn't given you one. In other words, if the patient said to you, well, I'd really like to come in December 12th, if they told you that during the discovery, make sure you have another alternative in mind in order to have them select December 12th as an option. It just makes it easier for patients to assume that they've actually given full consideration to the different options available and that they've selected an option. It's much better than just simply serving up December 12th. Next, you have to make sure that you present everything in writing, and that includes the calendar, the dates, the times. What I would suggest is to have a worksheet that's already created, and we have an example of what that worksheet could look like that you can download below. We have that worksheet that you can print out many times and then fill that worksheet out with all the details in respect to what you need to confirm with the patient. You'll probably need to take that worksheet and adapt it for your own purposes, especially if you have financing or any other aspects that relate to what it is that you do. But I think that's a great starting point to begin with, and you can feel free to download that worksheet and use it as is if you like. Make sure that everything is covered in that plan and set up the close with this. So here I'm going to describe for you what the worksheet contains. We call it the money worksheet. Even though we're talking about options at this stage, it leads us to the final conclusion of the presentation, which is essentially talking about money. We want to make sure that we have the name of the patient that they can fill in or we can fill in for them. We want to make sure that the recommendation is clearly listed there, either chosen from a list of options or written in if that makes it easier for us. We also want to make sure that we have a space for date and time that we can include when the actual recommendation can take place. In other words, when the treatment date and time is. You want to also list the person who's treating, who's performing the particular procedure, so that they're clear that the person that they just met with is ideally the person who ends up performing the treatment. That's an important connection. If it's somebody else different, then it's really, really important for that person to have been introduced before, during the examination stage, and ideally throughout the credibility statements. In other words, the credibility statement would have been about that person who's performing the treatment, not about yourself. We also want a space for initial investment, where the person can be told how much of a deposit they need to spend. We also then want the difference to be included in a space called balance investment. If the procedure is going to be financed, and I encourage your clinic to offer financing, because it's pretty much the standard today that if a clinic does not offer financing of some sort, whether it's interest-free or interest-bearing, it's really, really important to have some kind of monthly option for patients. Most patients walking around today, especially now in these more difficult economic times, don't exactly have thousands of pounds sitting in their bank account of disposable income, ready to take out and plunk on your desk and say, yes, I'd like to have this treatment, here is my payment. Instead, what they'd rather do is manage their finances monthly, which is what most of us do, and be able to fit this in with the rest of their finances on a monthly basis. So if you're doing financing, I would like a little space there where you can include the number of months over which the payment, the balance can be financed, not the full payment, but just the balance, the interest rate, if there's an interest rate applicable, and then the total investment. Now, clearly, if you need to contact a third party in order to get your interest rate calculations, do as many as you possibly can in advance so you know what these calculations are all about. If not, then simply do them with an online calculator that most of these third parties provide. In other words, you're going to have a computer at ready with that page open, not fumbling around looking for it, making sure that it's all ready to go with the numbers entered if you can. Then once the total investment is cleared at the bottom, make sure you have a space where the patient can sign and approve that. Effectively, this is what might be referred to as a purchase order. And that purchase order, despite it not being any kind of legally binding document, it's something that communicates to the patient that they have made a written declaration that they are indeed invested in having the procedure. This is considerably more credible and important than just simply having an oral or agreement or a simple handshake. Again, this doesn't require that the patient follow through with the procedure, but it does encourage the patient to take it more seriously. When you sign your name on something such as price, it becomes a lot more real. Now, I haven't told you how to introduce price or how to introduce initial investments yet. And that's because we haven't yet asked whether or not the patient is ready to become one of our patients yet. Right? So now I am about to suggest to you that at this stage you have to decide whether you're going to show the money side of the equation to everyone or whether you're not. If you have already declared your prices ahead of time on websites or on marketing materials, then there's no need to ask this question. You have to assume that the patient is going to be a patient, and then you just proceed to discussing the money. If, however, you keep your prices more close to the chest and are a little bit more discreet with your pricing and don't reveal your prices beforehand, you need to ask the patient if they're prepared to become a patient with you today, in order for them to say yes to that option, and then for you to come back later and say, okay, well, now that you are, then here's the price. Okay? You want to make sure that they are completely happy to become a patient now and have the treatment later. Because let me explain something to you. If they don't know the price yet, and they're not ready to become a patient just yet, then what on earth do you think is going to make them want to become a patient after you tell them how much it costs? Right? It's not going to encourage them any further. They have to want to do this before they actually see the price. Now, again, if you're already showing your prices on your websites or on your marketing materials already, there's absolutely no reason to ask this question. In fact, it's not a good question to ask, because we have to assume that if they already knew the price coming in, then price really shouldn't be an issue, should it? I mean, they've come in for a consultation, they've seen the price on the website. Why would we even discuss whether price is an issue? We wouldn't, because the price is already well known. It's only if the price is something that's being held back until you can assess properly and you price separately for this particular patient. If that's the case, you need to make sure that the patient is completely happy with everything that's been discussed. make sure that all the objections are handled before you go on to the money objection. Now, I'm going to be briefly discussing handling objections very soon, so we are going to have a discussion around that. But we also want to talk a little bit about how to ask for money, because I know that in many particular different kinds of cases, we want to be doing this slightly differently. I know as well that a lot of people in medical clinics have a big problem with discussing money, and that probably arises from the fact that this kind of industry is fairly new, and there hasn't been a tradition so much, especially in the UK and in Europe, of charging money for medical procedures. However, in Canada and the United States, perhaps more so in the United States, without a doubt, there is a long tradition of charging people for medical procedures. So they have a little bit less apprehension surrounding the money discussion than we do culturally here, especially in the UK and in many cases in Europe. Money tends to be something that people don't want to talk about. However, we need to get over that. This is a business. The whole purpose of doing these consultations is so that we can actually get the person to this stage, recommend a procedure that they most want and is best suited for them, and then charge them in the amount of money that procedure costs. So, if the patient answered your question, do you want to become a patient? And they said, well, no, I need to think about it. Then before showing the money worksheet, you need to ask them another question. You need to ask them, is there anything that would prevent you from becoming one of our patients today? Okay? That is a very bold question, and you need to ask it if they're not ready. You need to know why they're not ready. And if they say, well, I'm not ready because I need to know how much money it is, okay. Well, then you have to say, okay, I understand that completely. Apart from the money, is there anything else that would prevent you from becoming one of our patients today? Okay? Now, that focuses the patient on other issues outside of the money. Hopefully, if everyone has done their job to this point, including the practitioner who's covered off all the medical objections, there will not be any objections apart from money. Okay? And if that's the case, then then the patient will answer, no, there's nothing else, it's entirely fine. Then, assuming you've been quiet and you've listened for that, then you move on to the next stage, which is presenting the money. If, however, there have been other objections, then you need to address them. And you need to address them using my objection handling process that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about later. Now, why do we want to make sure we use what I call the money trial close? In other words, apart from the money, is there anything else that would prevent you from becoming one of our patients today? Well, we want to make sure that we address any product or treatment-related objections before we handle money. What we want to do is isolate any objection they have to money alone. That allows us to focus on that issue and to not have the complications surrounding all of the other possible objections that we should have either handled at an earlier stage or at least before we got to money. So if you don't answer the product objections, if you don't deal with the objections, the medical objections to the treatment, then the money is not going to make them want this treatment anymore. Okay? This is really important. So don't rush to provide prices. Make sure that you have addressed the fact that these people want it. Think about it this way. If you want something, you want it and then want to discuss how much it costs. If you don't want something, then why is the money even a consideration? It shouldn't even be discussed, because if you don't want the thing, then no amount of money is going to make a difference, whether it's cheap or expensive. So just make sure you handle all product objections before you get to the money, and you'll be in a much, much better position to be able to address money in exchange for something they really want. Yeah, you have to balance these equations. The money that they have to spend has to balance with their desire to want the product. If you don't achieve a balance, then there's not going to be a sale. If the desire for the product is low, money is never going to make that desire higher. Yeah, in fact, it might only make it worse. So I need you to make sure that you handle all objections before you get to the money. It's super important, and then you'll be in a much better position to get to the next stage. If they've said no to the money trial close, you then need to understand what their objections are. So now this is difficult. It's a challenge. Not only are we talking about money, which is difficult natively for most people, but we're also communicating information about how to deal with people based on options. Yeah, we're talking about a decision tree here. So I really, really need you to be careful with this and to practice it several times with a partner and have them say no to the money trial close and have them say yes to the money trial close. And once you've done that, both times and several times at that, then you'll be able to become in a much better position to be able to address the responses that your patients give you. Again, this will take a long time to do right. It takes about 21 times to do anything before it becomes learned and into a habit. And you got to do it right for those 21 times. So I would urge you to work with somebody to get through this money trial close, especially since it's a more difficult aspect of the presentation. This is, after all, where we are closing. And closing requires quite a bit of skill and quite a bit of calmness in you to be able to do this appropriately. If you're nervous, it's going to show. And if you're nervous, then the patient's going to get nervous. And if the patient gets nervous, they're going to slow down. They're going to want to think about it. They're going to want to go home. And you might never see them again. So the next stage where we're going to discuss really is the handling of objections. We're going to assume for a moment that patients actually did object and they had issues that would prevent them from actually paying you money or even considering money before they're completely satisfied with the procedure. So that's what we're going to talk about next. It's handling objections.